Hey everyone, Taylor Scollin here from North 99. The video you're about to watch is a recording of our North 99 live event in May with David Moscrop, the author of a book called Too Dumb for Democracy, question mark at the end. And it's a really interesting book, a look at why we make the political decisions we do and how we can go about making better ones than maybe we have been making in the past few years. It was a fascinating conversation. David was a very insightful and entertaining guest. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. One note, there was a little bit of a technical difficulty during the recording. So there's about 4 or 5 minutes where we lost the actual video footage. The audio is still there, so you can hear it all. But about 30-40 minutes in, there's a little gap in the video. So do bear with us there. We're not experts on the AV stuff, but we're trying to figure it out. If you want to come to future North 99 Live events, just sign up on our website, north99.org, and you'll get an email letting you know when we're having one near you. Otherwise, please enjoy the video.
Are we too dumb for democracy?
Was that your first question? It's like opening with, which one of you is Spartacus? So the title of the book is Too Dumb for Democracy. I'm going to hold it up. It's very good. So the title of the book is Too Dumb for Democracy, question mark. You'll notice right here there's a question mark that's doing a lot of important work. And the title I took, you can't copyright a title, fun fact. And so I took it from CBC. Years ago I did an episode of Ideas, and it was called Too Dumb for Democracy, full stop. And the producers came up with it. And so CBC Ideas goes out to a lot of people. 500,000 people alive, for instance. And I remember thinking afterwards, oh shit, they're not gonna like that. You can't really get away with calling 500,000 people dumb. I'm really going to hear it. Because people on the internet have thoughts. And they're more than happy to share them with you. And so I went to bed, and I woke up the next day, and I got these emails, text. Everyone, I love that title. I love that episode. I know exactly who you're talking about. Everyone was assuming I was talking about someone else and had exempted themselves. But the truth is, it's a universal question and it applies to everyone. And the answer is, no, we're not necessarily too dumb for democracy. We have plenty of capacity. In fact, when you devolve power to people within institutions, you find that they do a great job at coming up with political decisions, at managing resources, at doing all kinds of things. But we're encouraged to make bad political decisions by the sort of institutions that currently exist and the social structures, environmental features around us that encourage us to effectively, allow people to exploit cognitive shortcomings, if we even have the chance to try making political decisions in the first place. So I'll finish the answering with putting the question back to you. Think of, or a challenge, think of the last time you were asked to make a political decision, really. How often are you actually asked to make a political decision or substantively engaged with by political leaders? I suspect the answer is almost never.
How do you define the political decision?
Voting, every time we vote.
How do we define a political decision? You go on with
So,
in the book, right?
yeah, so, there's a decision point, for instance, at which you will have to cast a ballot, right? So we're asked to cast a ballot, municipal elections, provincial elections, federal elections. Parties like to talk about how they love turnout. They love certain kinds of turnout, right? They don't universally love all turnout. And I know this because whenever I talk to parties about the idea of say, mandatory voting, they're like, yeah, but do we really want everyone showing up, right? We want them to want to show up, I said, which is basically code for we want to mobilize our people, right? And to hell with everyone else who stays home. So there's the point at which you vote. Or you're asked a policy position. But if you're being asked about a policy position, it's probably by a pollster, maybe. Are you routinely consulted by leaders about your positions on something? No, of course you're not, right? The way I like to put it is, imagine that democracy was like the World Cup. I'm a soccer fan. I take a month off every 2 years to watch all the games in the Euros or all the games in the World Cup. I watch every single game. And I'm like, I'm not going to work for them. And I don't. And the amazing thing with the World Cup is when you're watching the world's best, both men and the women, play at the height of their capacity. And how do they get so good? They practice a lot. They practice between World Cups. Right? What would it look like if they didn't practice between World Cups? It would look like the men's national team. Not the women's national team, by the way, world class, but the men's national team. It would be utterly awful. Because we're not asked to practice between elections, right? We're just not. It's not something we're asked to do or encouraged to do, or incentivized to do, or even enabled to do. And so it just never comes up. And that's part of the issue, right?
So for those who haven't read the book, it sort of starts with equal parts a discussion of cognitive science, political science, and then this sort of half Jeremiah, half prescription of what we could actually do about the problem. But you really start by saying a feeling I think most, if not all of us, can relate to when we were up very late at night in November 2016 and then woke up the next morning thinking it had all been a bad dream. And I certainly remember I was in the UK, so I both stayed up all night and then still woke up both really not hungover from alcohol, hungover from feeling this sense of dread that I'd never really felt before. And thinking this is what it must have been like to have had a mad king back in the medieval ages. And I've kind of become numb to it since, but that's how you start off the book in some ways, to say, we've made some really bad decisions across the world. Brexit's an example as well, but the clown at the top of the news is a symptom, isn't actually the problem.
Oh yes, I mean, I woke up the day after Trump was elected and I was alcohol hungover as well as politics hungover. Like I was watching it. I mean, whatever you think of Trump's politics, one of the threats of Donald Trump is that he is a major threat to democratic norms, which were already, in the case of the United States, compromised. They've been compromised. Well, I mean, look, the country was founded on at least 2 crimes. Well, actually 3 crimes, if you count the revolution itself. The least of which, by the way, slavery, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and then the actual revolutionary moment itself, which was technically a crime. And the country was based on that, so it got off to a rough start. And the system itself was never conducive to sort of stable, effective politics. The American political system has been called America's most dangerous export, which is fucking saying something about a country that exports some pretty nasty stuff. And it doesn't work. There was a puzzle in political science for a long time. It's like, how is it the US presidential system doesn't work anywhere except for the United States? And the solution to the puzzle was, it doesn't work there either. It doesn't work anywhere. So this was dreamt up and this was the start of it. But the US norm started to decline precipitously after the Johnson administration. And you know what it was? In a book called How Democracies Die talks about this, Ziblatt and Levitsky. Lyndon Johnson said, you know what, we're going to pass the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. We're going to break the Southern Consensus, which actively contributes to racial segregation and apartheid. And we're going to do something about civil rights. And that was the beginning of the end of America, which to me was evidence that it was never going to work in the first place. So Trump was the opportunistic infection that was the result of a very, very ill patient being very, very ill for a long time. So I'm sitting there watching the election results, and that was what I was thinking. I'm a lot of fun to watch elections with, as you can imagine. So I said to my friend, you know what, forget it. We see where this is going. We're going to drink some beers, we're going to play some video games, and then we went to bed. And the next morning, the press started to call. And I was hungover, and I hadn't slept, and I was a little bit cranky, and I was worried that democracy was going to collapse in our lifetime. So I wasn't in a great mood. And the questions were, could it happen here? And why did it happen? And that was essentially the beginning of, at least in my head, of what became the book, which was also my doctoral dissertation. But the point being that institutions matter first of all, is that when you're thinking about political decision making, you're thinking about democratic participation, you as an individual, you're important, you're inherently valuable, you're inherently someone worthy of dignity and respect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're probably not very powerful. Collectively, when we come together and take part in institutions, we become very strong. The question is, okay, well, how do we do that within institutions that help us produce good political decisions? And in the context of Western democracies, we don't really have those institutions. And in the United States, we're watching it fall apart. In Canada, in Northern Europe, and a few other democracies, it's not so shabby, it's not too shabby. But the question that I push back on is, our current democratic institutions, which aren't that democratic or inclusive, they're fine, but they're not particularly good. What's going to happen to them when the worst of the challenges that are coming arrive? So the shifting geopolitical order, we don't know what it's going to look like, but I can't think of many empires that decline gracefully. In the US is a declining empire. It's effectively done for. It'll be done for in the next century for sure. And climate change. What happens when something on the order of magnitude of 10 times worse than the Syrian refugee crisis, which we did not handle particularly well in 2015, or before, or even for that matter, typically that well after, when something 10 times worse than that starts to arrive, alongside water shortages, food shortages, extreme weather, fires, flood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Bill Nye was on, someone knows what I'm talking about, was on MSNBC or CNBC recently having a chat. He's like, in 50 years, you'll be growing corn up where Canada would normally be. What the fuck did you just say? Did you just say where Canada would normally be? And everyone was like, we plan to be here still. But we're at a moment where our democratic institutions are in some senses fine, in some senses unhealthy, but it's about as good as it's going to get. Right. The challenges are only going to get worse. And we've relied for a long time on the assumption of a more or less stable geopolitical world order and a southern neighbor that is, at least towards us, moderately well behaved, along an defended border, integration for trade, integration for NORAD, allyship with NATO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do we think that paradigm is going to hold for the next century? And if it doesn't, what do we do then? And if it doesn't, what's the political system look like here? Does it look like democracy?
So, and that's the big picture that we're dealing with, but in our own brains, you also write a lot about how we're really good at flight or fight. We're really good at analyzing problems in front of us, and some of us can program a computer or try a case in a court. But what we aren't good at is having multiple information inputs coming at us all at once, some of which are coercive, some of which are not particularly true, and we're getting it on our mobile phones, on our TV, constantly, all day, every day, and we don't even have a chance to hear from our leader before we're hearing the pundits score what he said like it's TSN. So you also talk a lot about how our own brains just can't handle how much politics and how much political crap essentially is thrown at us.
Yeah, so imagine this, I don't want to, be careful of evolutionary determinists. Very, very carefully too. I was talking earlier today about Bill Gates really likes Jared Diamond. There you go. But there's an editorial in a peer-reviewed journal called Fuck Jared Diamond. And there's a critique of Jared Diamond and sort of the determinists, right? Who sort of over-leverage simple explanations to explain complex phenomena. So I don't want to do that, but I will say this. We evolved very, very slowly for a very, very long time for a very, very particular environment. So there are things that we're good at, there are things that we've evolved and adapted to do. Very few of those things are the things we do day to day now. We are overwhelmed, we are overtaxed, we are overburdened, we are asking our brains to do things that we can do, but they don't come easily. We're what's known as cognitive misers. We like to take shortcuts, mental shortcuts. We like to use what's known as heuristics. We often will jump to snap judgments, or we'll use things like, do I like this person, as a substitute for, do I trust their policy, or is their policy good? We will sub in easy questions to answer. Do I like that person? For difficult questions, should we build a pipeline? And it's not because we're bad people. It's not because we're stupid. It's because we are doing other things, right? So Dan Levitin, in a book called The Organized Mind, my publisher is always like, you've got to flog your book. You've got to promote your book. Then I do these things and I promote other people's books. But Dan Levitin wrote a book called The Organized Mind that's very good. And he says between 1986, between 1986 and 2011, the amount of information that Americans process in their leisure time went up by sixfold. So in your off time, you consume about 100,000 words, or about 34 gigabytes of information. The brain processes, I can't remember, I should look this up, 120 bits a second. It's a tiny amount. We've created a world with 300 exabytes of information. So 3 followed by 20 zeros, I think. And in a world which is overwhelming. So think about your day, what it looks like. Think about the amount of information that you're asked to process in a given day, online and offline. Think about the tasks that you're asked to do each day. And think about the system in which you're asked to do them. You have no support to engage as a citizen. You have no support or incentive to collect information, to consider it, to have discussions, debates, and to participate in political life. And yet you're asked to be a citizen in this broader context, but without a lot of support to do that. Now, political parties and technocrats like that system, right? Because we devolve that, we send that authority to them. The pushback that I'm saying is we've got these brains that we ask to do tricky things. We're really bad at them. We can be better if we practice, but we're not given any opportunity or support or chance to do that practice. And so what we get instead is people who want to manipulate or exploit those cognitive shortcomings, right? I mean, what sort of political messages do we see day to day?
Fake news.
Yeah, we have people calling things fake news. We get politicians that are doing memes now. You know, I mean, you get attack ads, you get sound bites, you get, what's question period about?
But you also get, don't judge me on what happened, judge me on the fact that I'm Justin Trudeau and you either love me or hate me.
Or the Tories will win.
Or interpret actions through your existing affiliation.
Absolutely. Or you get, encouraged to be a partisan. Or politicians have known this for years and years and years. It's not really what you say, it's how many times you say it. Right? So you can stand up, a Tory, I mean, I'm nonpartisan, I'm just using examples that, and there are some worse offenders. A Tory can stand up in the House of Commons and ask a question to a Prime Minister that's not even in the House, and then be outraged when they don't get an answer, because they know the camera's going to pick it up, it's going to be used out of context on the news, on Twitter for a poll quote or a poll video, and no one's going to know that the Prime Minister wasn't even in the House of Commons. Right? And there are plenty of tricks like this. So that's the challenge. So what happens is we have brains that have evolved to do some things well, some things less well. The brain's not a computer. There's a Nobel-winning biologist, Gerald Edelman, who wrote a great book, and he talks about the fact that brains aren't computers. They process things very slowly. We recreate the world, right? We don't represent the world as it is. We recreate it in our heads. When we draw on a memory, we're not retrieving it from a data bank, we're recreating it every time. You're making your own reality every time you're processing the world or processing a memory. That is easily exploited, and routinely is. And this is the world in which we operate. So we're asking the brain to do these things. The environment and elites are encouraging us to do another thing, because it's good for business. Politicians don't want you, including some of whom are my friends, they don't want you to make good political decisions, they want you to support them. But to bring it around before I come back to the next question, my argument is that's going to get us in a lot of trouble real fast. Because in the long run, we're going to rely on people to believe, to have trust in the system, but also to make sure that the things they want are represented in the system. And the only way you can do that is through deeply engaging with people in a meaningful way.
Well, and I think we also, it's not just our brains that evolved on a savanna or in the Fertile Crescent, it's that our in some ways in their heyday in the 19th century and haven't changed. I want to be careful how I phrase this, because you started off by saying a lot of people love the title and they said, I know exactly who is too dumb for democracy. But we actually do have some statistics that there's a particular demographic group that I almost want to say through no fault of their own is predisposed to be manipulated online, and that is to say older white men who are disproportionately perhaps less educated, and they didn't grow up on the internet. They're the ones who, it appears, are most susceptible to what I guess we'd call fake news.
I mean, so, the line I like to use is, if you were to custom build an environment hostile to good political decision making, it would look like ours. Right? It would look exactly like ours. And by a good political decision, I just mean a rational, autonomous one. You should be able to collect information about the world that's coherent and accurate, and you should be able to evaluate it as such. And you should be able to come up with reasons for or against things that are true reasons, that you can support, that you could explain. And you should be able to share those with other people who recognize them as reasons. And years ago there was a study in the 1980s by a scholar named Paul Snyderman and his colleagues. And they asked people, do you support social welfare? Yes or no? And people said, no, I don't. I said, okay, well, why not? Moral hazard. You ever hear this one? Anyone want to guess what the moral hazard argument is? What happens if we give people money?
Lazy.
Oh, they're so lazy. Unlike the wealthy class who work hard by owning shares and collecting passive income that they get a special tax rate for. The job creators. I'm a real eat the rich kid right now.
They worked very hard to be born.
Don't let the suit fool you. Don't let the suit fool you. So they said moral hazard, and so the researchers said, okay, interesting. So these people truly believed, whether or not they were motivated by emotion or they were motivated by rational reflection, these people, uninterrogated, believed that the reason they opposed social welfare payments was moral hazard. Which, you know what, could be a decent argument. I happen to reject the moral hazard argument in and of itself, but at least that's a coherent argument to engage with. Does anyone want to guess, when the researchers ran regressions and followed up and dug in, does anyone want to guess what the real reason was? They were racists. They were bigots. It was, well, we don't want those people to get the money. Because, So we do stuff like this all the time, right? Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky had a study in 1980. We got a big U of O Kahneman fan. They did a study, and it was they were studying the psychology of risk, and it was, okay, there's an avian flu. This was back in 1981. There's an avian flu. It's threatening 600 lives. There were two groups. Group A got 2 options. Group B got 2 options, but the A option for both groups was slightly different. For one group, it was 200 people will die, and for the other group, it was 400 people will be saved. Does anyone want to guess what happened? 50-point swing in support, depending on whether you said 200 will die or 400 will be saved. 50 points. 22% versus 72%. Based on whether you tweaked the emphasis to focus on loss or gains. Ditto this old trope about you have to have a surgery, lung surgery. 90% success rate, who wants it? That's pretty good. 10% failure rate, no.
And that is called polling.
Yes, well, this is what I mean. So this is what we're dealing with, right? And so this is the environment in which we're dealing with these challenges. So that becomes a problem if the idea is we want people making rational political decisions. Now, can you very quickly remind me what your question was? I'm usually really good at remembering.
The fact that older white.
Oh yes, so right. So it is just a fact that now we're in an environment in which social media dominates, it shapes, it does a bunch of things. So one of the powerful things of social media is it doesn't just shape opinions, it also shapes what we're talking about. So when we talk about foreign threats to democracy and foreign threats to elections, one of the challenges is large troll nets, botnets, sock puppets, astroturf bombs, run from God knows where, can affect what we talk about and how we talk about it, as well as what we perceive. Because it's cheap, easy, fast, and effective. And we've learned that There have been efforts since 2013 at least to shape political discourse in Canada online, coming from, among other places, Russia, Syria, and Venezuela. And it was basically trying to sow division, but also to agenda set. So the other thing is, one of our psychological, what would you call it, predispositions, is availability, right? We want to talk about things that are at the top of our head. And if something's at the top of our head, we think it's more important. And we're going to start evaluating people on it. So you have strategic actors online trying to forefront issues that are divisive, like refugees and immigration and pipelines. And so the internet is a vector for not just misinformation, but for nefarious agenda setting. And we fall for it all the time. And there is a group who is objectively worse at it, and it is in general, older folks. Again, not a capacity issue. It is a digital native, or a digital, I'm trying to find a different word for that, because that word's terrible.
Whatever Gen Z.
Yeah, it is a younger versus older issue. There's some people who grew up in this environment, some who didn't. So there is a significant difference. That the folks who are doing the vast majority of retweeting and sharing and falling from sort of fake news and misinformation are older folks. And so we have a serious problem, in part because, does anyone ever look at the swing, if you disaggregate turnout, you ever look at the breaking down the turnout numbers? If you've got a turnout of 68%, that probably represents 80% of folks, 65 to 74 voting, and 25% of folks 26 and younger. So there's also a further problem that you have a sort of demographic misrepresentation, more generally speaking. And a sort of a generation of citizens who are dialed out and think the system's stacked and they don't want to be a part of it. No one's asking them to be a part of it. And now we've got people who are trying to leverage this environment to manipulate and exploit us. And they're doing really well at it. And then we try to fix it, and who we have on the case, we have to deal with oligopolistic tech companies that are not up to the job or interested in doing it because they make a lot of money. Anyone want to know, you might know this, shout it if you do, one of the worst radicalizing forces in the world? YouTube. Cory Doctorow put it really well. He says, the internet isn't creating these people, it's connecting them, it's finding them. It's finding them and it's mobilizing them. And YouTube is one of those places. It's like you go onto YouTube, and you're like, I'm going to learn how to fix my engine. You watch the video, and the next is, yes, good. Would you like to see this Jordan Peterson video? Jordan Peterson completely destroys small engine repair. Let's let that one sit for a second. But so, because the YouTube algorithm is forefronting popular content, and it's auto-playing, and it's radicalizing people, but it's also misinforming people, and YouTube is one of those vectors. And we've learned that Facebook has utter contempt for folks who are trying to fix this, to the point where they were called to appear before a committee, and they just decided they weren't even going to respond. And that's on the one hand. So the sort of corporate tech oligopolies on the one hand that make their money off of this, and on the other hand, a government, including a government who doesn't want to take political parties and put them under privacy legislation because they don't really want to have to deal with privacy legislation. And a government, by the way, that has, the liberals have an advantage in the digital space, so they've been very cautious in the way they approach the digital space. But so I'm saying is we don't necessarily have the tools or the actors to address this properly, but even if we did, we don't even know what the model looks like yet. We're still figuring out the model, and we're figuring it out at a time where we're facing a number of other challenges, and this is what we're trying to do. But so the way that I cash this out is saying that it is a moment to double down on democracy. It is the moment to say that what we should be doing is going back to citizens, creating institutions in which they can participate in political decision making, supporting decision making at the individual level through things like participatory democracy, like citizen assemblies or participatory budgeting exercises, reference panels. And then supporting them through things like transferring wealth to make it possible. You can't have a fully functioning democracy if you don't democratize the economy. It doesn't work. Not really. And ensuring that people have a legitimate chance to participate in the political system and to make good political decisions supported by, with the resources they need to do it. And the line I always use when I'm talking to politicians, for some reason they still talk to me, because I look like this and I wear this, I can come out here and say, eat the rich, and tomorrow go talk to a cabinet minister and no one will blink. That's how fucked up the system is. No, and I will say to them, look, I mean, I like you guys. I'm great, fine. We can do this the easy-ish way today, or the hard way tomorrow. Trust me, the easy way is way better. You are Louis the 16th in like 1780. Louis, I think people are. I was out in the market today. They're not having a great time. They're pretty angry. No, I think it's okay. 1782. I think we should call the Estates General. Let's just have them in, blow off some steam. Maybe we can do a little reform, a little constitutional this, that, a little redistribution. Now we're fine. It's like 1789. Oh, I've got some bad news. There's some people who'd like to see you. Let's go to Varennes. You know, and it's a very specific joke that one person got me. The line I'm trying to use, though, is, I mean this very, very seriously, because it's something I've thought about a lot and worked on, is the democratic decay can be addressed and reversed and mitigated, as can climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you've got to be way ahead of the curve. Like you've got to look at the current system and say, the things that got us here, the playbook that got us here, is not going to get us across the goal line, right? Hardest thing in sports, to get to the championship and throw out the playbook that got you there. As someone who played a lot of losing hockey and a lot of losing football, I promise you it's true. But this is what we've reached. We've reached a point where we're going to have to look and say the institutions that got us here are insufficient to get us into the next century, the economic institutions and the political institutions. And what are you going to do about that? We are Louis in France in 1780. We can do this, but it's better to do it the easy way now.
So you round off a few, and this is my last question, democratic reform, participatory democracy, potential solutions that I've kind of called the eat your vegetables approach to fixing the problem. Is there anywhere or anyone on the scene, let's say both in Canada but more importantly internationally, who seems to be doing this well?
There are participatory democratic institutions and egalitarian economic institutions throughout the world. No one is good at everything, which means that some enterprising country could decide tomorrow that they wanted to pick and choose the best stuff around the world and make a go of it. We could do that tomorrow in Canada. We could decide to adopt citizens' assemblies like we're used in, I mean, we've had a couple here, but we could institutionalize them. They've been done in Belgium. They had 700 and change. It was done in Ireland. It was done in British Columbia. It was done in Ontario. They're done at the local level, the municipal level, all the time. There's an organization, or there's a website called Participedia. It is a joint effort from a bunch of researchers, and it is a Wikipedia of democratic innovation, participedia.net. I don't know why anyone uses .net, but for some reason it's participedia.net. It's fantastic. Full disclosure, my PhD supervisor is part of that group that runs it. But it's very, very good, and it will list all of the things people do. Now, the argument I make is that we should institutionalize these things, not let politicians use them as one-offs to democracy wash. Well, we consulted the people. Because there's another great book by Jendia Fuji-Johnson at SFU, and she says, when Canada does democratic participatory things, which we do from time to time, they are always great, and then politicians leave them on the shelf. They don't do anything with it. They're like, thank you for your time. So what we need to do is institutionalize them and give them some teeth. So you can look, now that's at the sort of participatory level. So there are models. We don't need democratic innovations. We have all the democratic innovations we need. We have known more or less what to do since Athens, ancient Athens. We've known for years. It's about egalitarian talk that among people who see themselves as equal, but specifically deliberation. I'm a big proponent of deliberative democracy. It's a very specific, reason-giving based way of doing democracy. We know what to do, we know how to do it. What we need to do is build it into our institutions and give it some teeth. That's on the political participation side. In the book, I run through examples of what individuals can do to become better political decision makers in their own home in 20 minutes a day. You buy a copy now. So there are things individuals can do too. There's a little program there. Even being aware of cognitive biases, for instance, makes you better. Surrounding yourself with people who disagree with you in a productive way helps. A bunch of stuff like that.
This is the professor assigning homework part of the program.
About 20 minutes a day. As someone who watches a lot of Netflix, and like my battery was dying because I was playing on my phone the whole day, it's not a lot, but you know, it is a civic good. So there's this sort of individual thing, but then of course there is the egalitarian argument. Now, there's good evidence to suggest that no society can survive too much inequality. At some point, the whole structure of the polity, of the state, whatever it may be, becomes unsustainable if that sort of inequality becomes too much to bear. If the economy generates a lot of wealth, but that wealth isn't redistributed in a way that allows people to have decent lives and to take part in political life, and if their interests aren't represented on up the chain, then forget about it. That's it. You're already done for. And a couple of years ago, Gillens and Page, a couple of political scientists in the United States, wrote a paper, and in very political sciencey words, called the U.S. an oligarchy. They studied American policymaking from 1970 to 2001. And do you know what they found? They were on The Daily Show. Back in the Jon Stewart days, way back. When I was young. You know what they found? Any guesses? That the vast majority of public policy and law made in the United States was made for the 1%. That effectively, America had become so unequal that it was no longer functionally a democracy. It was an oligarchy with elections. How long is that sustainable? We're already seeing the fraying of that. And to bring it back around to my initial point is, part of the reason you want to make good political decisions is that for one, it produces better decisions, it produces more trustworthy decisions, but it also gets you more of what you want. And you can then represent that into the policy space and get it represented in law and policy. So, which is good for the long-term health of the democracy, but you also people need to think that the system is working for them. They need to think that the economic institutions are giving them a fair chance. And to the extent that this generation, my generation, Generation Squeeze writes about this, is going to be, vis-a-vis their parents, poorer, housing's going to cost more, they're going to earn less, they're going to work more, they may or may not be able to retire, they may or may not be able to breathe the air, right? Like we're facing this generational shift where I have this theory that the baby boomer generation won the ultimate generation lottery. Let me submit this to you. I don't blame them for this. This isn't their fault. Is there a better generation to have been born in than the boomer generation in all of human history? I don't think so. I really don't. And yet, people then would say, look, it's the Steven Pinker crowd. Look at all that progress. And then here we are, at the edge of the precipice. This is us, the millennial generation on. And it's going to go like this. So it was all this great progress, right up until the point where we reached the edge of the cliff and we flung ourselves off.
But history had ended, so.
History did end in the 1990s. Yeah. But even Fukuyama has walked that back. But my point being that, so this is, the challenge is recognizing that the sort of generational curve, it was great, 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 and now we've reached this significant tipping point that is effectively unprecedented. And we've got to figure out what to do about that, or else we're in big, big, big trouble.
So that's the perfect segue to audience questions.
I'm supposed to do this thing, my agent tells me this, you're supposed to like valley, 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 and then you bring people up out of the valley at the end, because otherwise everyone's like, oh my god. So whoever asked the last question, like the second last question, make,
They just shut it out and then just repeat it.
Oh, perfect.
because nobody buys your book if you just leave them in the valley.
So we're at, it's very troubling.
I guess it's not really a question that I have, but a comment. I'm like the economy is like on the top of the agenda for however many years is what people like vote based on like how they feel about the economy. And everyone's scared about what it's doing, but like they don't know what it actually is.
You know, I was hoping, I'm actually going to make you feel even worse about things.
Okay.
I'm sorry. There was a study by Mark Pickup and Evans, something Evans. I want to say Chris Evans, but that's Captain America.
Anyway, do that.
You can do anything as Captain fucking America. So there's a study by Evans and Pickup, and what they found was, it's called reversing the causal arrow. And evaluations of the economy are shaped by partisanship. And so your evaluation of the economy is determined by your partisanship, not the other way around. Now, if we were working right, we would say, I'm going to look at the economy, I'm going to choose who I vote for and support based on how the economy is doing, which would be the normal thing to do. And that's what we expect. But in fact, the normal thing is to say, who do I like? Now let's look at the economy. And if the person I like is in power, economy is doing really well. And if the person I don't like is in power, economy is doing really poorly. Now, that's not it. That's not everyone. But it's not just a literacy issue. It's also a deep partisan bias issue as well. Is that the filter through which we see the world is often, Kant, Immanuel Kant. I was trying not to mention Kant. He's in the book. He used to get so drunk he couldn't find his way home. Everyone thinks of him as this stodgy teetotaler, but he wasn't. He got so drunk he couldn't find his way home. But Kant said, we see the world through sort of space and time goggles, right? This is how that was Kant's drunk goggles were space and time. And for us, we have other filters, and one of those filters is partisanship, right? And that affects our views of things like the economy. So part of it is economic literacy. But here's where you get to the problem, and this is the reason why I argue good political decisions shouldn't be based on the substance. Evaluating a good political decision should be about evaluating the process, not about the outcome. Because if someone looks at you and says, well, I'm a Keynesian, someone says, yeah, I really like Hayek or whatever. I had a guy quote Adam Smith to me today. Whenever someone, here's a pro tip for arguing with people on the internet. If they start using that Smith line about it's not from the benevolence of the baker or the butcher, just like, wrap it up. But if you have a fundamental disagreement about the premises, you've got nowhere to go, and that's the other problem. So what we need to do is build institutions in which we can exchange reasons for and against things based on fact, but where we can at least adjudicate those fundamental disagreements, if not resolve them, and to the point where we can say, okay, I can recognize your perspective because we've deliberated. But right now what we have is deeply partisan and deeply emotional exchanges that are rooted in, among other things, identity, or a self-interest of protecting resources that we fight about on the internet and then every 4 years vote on. And I'll finish really quick on that. When I was doing the book, I learned a really important lesson. If you're writing a book, here's a good lesson, or doing any kind of research, this is the project. If you're doing interviews, don't do them on Friday afternoons if you think the subject matter might be a downer. Because I kept interviewing these people, and I would talk to them on Friday afternoon, and I would just be like, I'm staying in. This is going to be a weekend in. So I talked to Ronald Wright, who did the 2003 Massey Lecture, Short History of Progress, and he on a Friday. And he said to me, when I wrote Short History of Progress, I gave us a 50-50 chance of surviving. Now it's 60-40 against. And one of the things he pointed out was, our economic cycles and our political cycles are too short. They do not allow us to make long-term adjustments or to make long-term plans. And so if you're up for election every 4 years, and people sort of care about the environment, what are you going to do? You're going to adopt a carbon tax that is good policy, but woefully insufficient to address the problem that we're facing. Look at the fight we just had in this country over the carbon tax, which market fundamentalists like Shell likes the carbon tax, and we still had to have this fight. It's not even done yet. And even the left and the right agree that it's actually not that effective. If the goal is to meet our Paris Accord targets. And that's what we're doing because we're on 4-year cycles. And it's like, if you ever watch this is my favorite things. Like a company will have an earnings report, publicly traded companies. and they'll hit their target, and their share will go down, and it'll be like, yeah, but shareholders expected you to exceed your target, right? Because that is how we think. Short bursts on quarters. I mean, how do you address long-term problems that way?
So I'm a political science student. So
Where?
this from UBC.
Nice.
But this sort of thing interests me. But I find that a lot of my friends or people that I know, the extent of their political knowledge is that like Justin Trudeau is attractive or something like that. Like it's very superficial. So I think a participatory democracy is something that could really help. And I'm curious to hear how you think like.
I'm just going to repeat your question, sorry.
How that could somehow mix in with some sort of incentive system, perhaps something like UBI, or how that could potentially.
So that's a good question. The question is, participatory democracy is good, but a lot of people's judgment boil down to, is Justin Trudeau attractive? Every time someone asks a question, I can think of a study that's just going to bum us out even more. I'm going to do it again. You want to hear something that's really going to bum me out?
No.
I'm great. This is like my first date. It's like, really nice to meet you. You want to hear a study that's really going to bum you out? So, Todorov in Princeton, I think, did this study. And took a bunch of subjects and said, look, you're going to look at a picture of two candidates. You're going to get, I think it was a millisecond of exposure to these faces. I want you to tell me which of these two looks most competent to you. 1 millisecond, 5 milliseconds of exposure. Boom. These are pictures people had never seen before. But what they were actually was pictures of candidates from out-of-state gubernatorial and senatorial races. And immediate judgments of competence predicted the winner of the election almost 70% of the time. So it wasn't like Justin Trudeau was hot, it was, this guy looks competent. Now, there's an evolutionary reason for that. There's at least an evolutionary explanation for it. But judgments of competence are socially conditioned, right? So who looks competent?
White men in suits.
Look how competent. I do this thing where when I fly now or when I do something, I will wear this. You can kind of do anything you want if you look like this and wear a suit.
I got a question for you. You're a white man in a suit saying you think competent men are white men in suits. I don't think that
No, I don't think so either.
No, but I'm just saying, you're saying that's what 70% of the time this happens.
Yeah.
Do they only poll just women? Because I don't think that way.
No,
I
I mean,
know so
so you're the
many
30%.
incompetent men and have worked with them for 40 years.
Yeah.
I'd never vote unless I knew for sure he
Yeah.
was.
Yeah,
I'd rather choose the woman.
yeah, you're the 30% then. It's the other 70 that's the problem.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I agree.
Thank you.
No, I agree.
Thank you very much.
It's a problem. But this is the problem, is that there is a sort of socially determined predisposition to give a pass to people who don't deserve one, and which is speaking to your point. And what happens with those privileges, with those unearned privileges, what happens to the benefits of that unearned privilege? They stack up, right? When you look around and say, well, it's a meritocracy. No, it's not. It's not. We know it's not. Because privilege stacks, and you're born with it. And it's socialized. So the question is, how do you undo that? Now, so this is the challenge. Now, the question is, how do you incentivize it? I have never met an apathetic person in my life. I truly mean that. I will stand by that. I have met a lot of alienated people, though. I've never met someone in my life who didn't care about anything. When you ask them, someone will say, oh, politics. But then you say, fine, politics. I get it, totally. But what about school? What about roads? What about farm care? What about daycare? What about taxes? What about job prospects? What about home ownership? What about your wait time for a job? They care. They care, they have positions. The question is, how do we motivate them to do it? And one of those things is, you don't need everybody. The truth is, everyone should have an equal chance to participate, but not everybody needs to participate. What we need to do is reach a critical mass. And so part of the reason I want to institutionalize citizens' assemblies and participatory budget is that as my friend Peter McLeod from Mass LBP will say, everyone should have a chance in their lifetime to be selected into one of these processes. And when they go and participate in civic life, what happens? They build friendships, they build networks, they build skills, they get heard, they get listened to, they feel good about it. And they want to do more. They feel like they have a purpose. You create a cycle, a positive cycle. And part of the challenge is skills. There's a paper by Brady, Verba. These names are boring, but I do it to cite my work. It's the academic in me. They had a paper called Beyond SES, Socioeconomic Status, and what they found was political participation, in part, is determined by, or its lack, whether or not people have the skills to do it. So it's not just about money, it's about having skills. But where do those skills come from? People were learning them from civil society, from church groups, from the Boy Scouts, from sports, from all these things. But the distribution of people who had a chance to do these things was inequitable. So then the question then becomes, how do we make sure everyone has a chance outside the political sphere to build skill sets that they can use inside the political sphere? And that's where we come to civil society. What we need to do is build a robust civil society in which people can go and meet people, network, develop connections, develop skill sets, practice those. And that includes sports, religion. It includes civil society organizations like this one. It includes political parties. It includes all kinds of things. But we gotta make sure that everyone has a shot. And how do you make sure everyone has a shot? You start by making sure everyone has some resources to be able to do that. Right?
Yeah, I want to kind of speak to what you just said in the sense of creating these critical spaces for people to talk to, and then also kind of what you were saying before about this reductionism that happens with kind of like Jordan Peterson type of narratives.
Yeah.
And I think those narratives are creating those civil society spaces for better or for worse. And then these like rather critical counter-hegemonic spaces like this are kind of inaccessible to people who aren't already engaged in these ideas. So whereas Jordan Peterson's 12 rules of whatever are very appealing and really speak to people and get people actively participating. So how do you speak to that gap, and how do you create these critical conversations that are institutionalized, counter-hegemonic, and still open and inviting to people who have never interacted with these concepts before? And how do you avoid those institutions from being influenced by things like capitalist motives?
This is a very good question. I mean, I jokingly hold up my book, but writing accessible books about politics is a revolutionary act these days. I wrote this book in part because I was frustrated that all these people writing about democracy wrote books that nobody could read, which is a problem. I'm a bit of a heretic when it comes to academia. I hate it. I don't want to do it for long. I want out. There's a lot of people playing a lot of silly games, sitting on their thumbs, publishing stuff that no one reads. No, that's fine. I mean, I support, the academy needs to be able to do that. But we also need people who can do the translation work and who can do the mobilization work, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So part of it is this. I mean, now if it's about a left-right thing, I mean, we can put it that way, or we can put it sort of, let's sort of put it left-right, because let's be honest, it is largely left-right. You've got to be able to go and write and produce accessible material. And and that might mean that I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. I get shit from the left sometimes, from certain people, for writing for the Washington Post. And my response is, you know what's nice? Getting to write about Rosa Luxemburg in the Washington Post. Isn't that nice? If I had said, I'm just going to write for Jacobin, which is fine, it's a great magazine, I would be talking to people who already agree with me, and we could deeply dissect Marcuse, we could have a great old chat about Engels, but everybody knows this stuff already. What the left needs to do, and I'm now talking I'm talking as a leftist, as a social democrat, et cetera, is to go out into the world and do the Jordan Peterson thing from the left. What this country needs, I have a deep, strange affinity for William F. Buckley. I don't know why. William F. Buckley, for those of you who don't know, was a right-wing American pundit, commentator, bon vivant, and was largely responsible for making the right respectable. People forget this, but in the 1960s in the United States, the country was liberal. The Republicans were liberal. The Democrats were liberal. Everyone was a liberal. In the aftermath of the New Deal, everyone was liberal, except for William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater. And Nixon is often known as one of the last liberal presidents, founder of the EPA. And so he mainstreamed a version of conservatism by having a column, by having a television program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The left needs to be ecumenical, and the left needs to be a little bit fun, and a little bit stylish, and accessible. And so if we want to create spaces for engagement, those spaces have to be welcoming, they have to be accessible, and they have to be like Jordan Peterson, but not bad. Does that make sense?
Are there any, this is probably going to need to be the last question. Is there anyone?
No, but
Yeah.
can we do two? Do we have time for two? Because this woman has had her hand up,
Oh, I'm sorry.
and I love the energy in the front here.
Perfect. There you go.
Working on energy all day.
I just, yeah.
Yeah. So my
Wait,
question-
can I ask you guys, whose question is more uplifting, would you say?
Mine's beige. Let her have it.
I think mine can take us up.
Can we end with you then? Would you
Yeah.
mind? Is that okay with you? Can we do yours and then one?
Sure. All right. Again, mine's beige. I don't know if
Yeah, that's perfect.
Cool. So I just finished a master's degree and I wrote about.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I wrote about the media, the public sphere. I know yourself you're a big fan of Habermas. Always think you see you on Twitter.
Yeah.
So I wrote about democratic participation, but from like a media perspective. I'm always interested in like what structure of media is best to produce a very fervent, or as Habermas would say, flourishing public sphere. And he notoriously doesn't really give a recommendation of a type of media.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any comments about the ideal media in I'm not finished, but whatever your ideal public sphere is. What would that media structure generally look like? Yes. What do you think it would look like?
One big comment section.
Yeah. One big concept.
No. I used to read the comment section when I first started writing, and everyone's like, don't read the comment section. And so I stopped, but then my mom and my grandma would read the comment section of pieces that I wrote. And so I'd get these messages from my mom or my grandmother, and they're like, people said some really mean things about you in the comments. Like, Mom, don't read the comments. She's like, okay, fine. I just got responded. My mom is like going through the comment section, starting flame wars.
My mom did the same.
It's nice. It's nice. And I'm like, shouldn't you be at work? So I don't know is the answer. I worry that the digital space as it is not just not that space, it's actually counterproductive. I mean, the sort of social media space has been liberating and democratizing in a lot of ways, but some research has suggested it's become, as one scholar put it, the weapon of the strong. That it's in fact reinforcing power structures rather than unbalanced, rather than democratizing, and so that becomes a problem. And sort of, Isaiah Berlin had a great line that freedom for the pikes is death to the minnows. And I worry that a social media space that isn't carefully regulated and patrolled, for like flagrant violations and harassment, whatever, is hostile to that. And the problem is, as long as it is a market-driven system, it's going to be very, especially run by multinationals who are much bigger than any given country's jurisdiction in some cases. It's hard to create a space that is conducive to those exchanges because the profit motive is such that they're not going to do it, right? So I actually think we're going to have to dance with the one that brought us, which is to say the digital media space. But we're going to have to find a way to engage with and moderate these spaces. And I think the best way to do it, there's two ways to do it. One is you build civic capacity outside of the digital space, so that when people come into it, they already have some training, some weapons, some skills. So there is a sort of external issue. And then internally, we've got to come up with a global effort, a sort of Geneva Convention for the Internet, as some people put it, or sort of a bloc of Canada, the EU, maybe the United States if they get their shit together or whatever, and so on, that says to these companies, we're going to band together and we're going to collectively demand certain regulations and certain best practices. Because it's easy for Google to say, Canada wants an ad bank, we're just not going to run ads during the election then, right? These companies are so big they can walk away from any individual market. But if the EU and Canada and so others got together, they could start to have an effect. And then we could sort of clean up that digital space. Because I don't think there's going to be an ideal public sphere. We're not going back to the 19th century, 18th century coffee houses, which were imperfect for reasons like this. But we can improve the space that we have. But it's going to take an international movement. And we've seen with the EU, they can get some regulations and some stuff done because they're such a big bloc, right? The challenge will be bringing countries together at a time where a lot of global tensions are sort of pulling them apart. Bring us home.
So right, okay. So it's an election year.
That's a bad start. That's a terrible start.
I'm just wondering, I guess through the lens of some of the conversations you've been having with, let's say, cabinet ministers or politicians, where you're talking about how there are ways that we could do it easy now versus harder ways in the long run. With it being an election year, and that means that there's a little bit more political activity and interest on our political system, I'm wondering if you could talk about some different theories of change or political pathways where you see that we could maybe raise the level of ambition around our electoral system or democracy. And I think the dark path for me is trying to make sense of real political pathways forward on particularly on electoral reform. But you know, it's also a different time, and seeing the announcements over the last couple of days from Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould, I'm wondering if you've got any hot takes on how we could shake things up this year.
Yeah, so if we get lucky, it'll be a minority government. You can get a lot done on minority government. You know, people forget this, but the Pearson years, 65 to 68, pretty good years. CPP, the flag, the auto pact. I mean, we laugh at the flag, but it was like, it was a way of moving, like, we're not British anymore. The auto pact, Medicare. There is stuff on the agenda right now, explicitly and more implicitly, pharmacare, for instance, serious action on climate change, so whatever the iteration of the New Deal might be. Citizens' assemblies, I know that there's a couple of parties that are thinking about this and talking about it. Even electoral reform. These things are on the agenda. Now, I would say, from a civil society perspective, if we can, if groups can band together here and there and have one big ask per group, say, like, this is the thing we want to do. I know a lot of people are doing this pharmacare. There's a chance to get it. Part of it will be about leveraging a moment. So, in the book, I talk about critical junctures and path dependency, and I use the example of, you're stranded on a desert island, you've got a hatchet. Never mind where the hatchet came from. But, you've got to go inland to make camp. What do? You hack your way in. And then you want to go back to the beach to see if anyone's going to come save you. What do? Well, you take the same path back. And you keep back and forth along the same path, and it becomes easier, and you keep doing it because, it's working for you. This is how we work, right? Path dependency. But every so often there's a critical juncture. Say one day there's a snake, and you're like, I'm going to go a different way. And then you go the different way, and you're like, oh, this is way better. We're approaching a critical juncture for a bunch of different reasons. Potential minority government, but also the rise of indigenous consciousness. One of the things that makes me most hopeful are indigenous people are like, yeah, we are here. There's a lot of us, and we're organizing, and we're not going to take a shit. And they're pushing in very compelling ways. But also the rise of environmental consciousness, that even the Tories are going to have an environmental plan. And now, the Tories used to be really good on the environment. Back in the Mulroney days, they were wildly progressive, right? I mean, they were quite good on a lot of things. Not so much anymore. But when it comes to those things, they're going to have to move. And so there are critical, the wisdom is, look at the critical junctures and decide what you can really get when you can exploit that moment. Because it's coming. I really do believe it's coming. And I think probably the best things will be pharmacare and Green New Deal as things to look at. And electoral reform is possible. but I will say this as someone who's been championing it for a very long time, provincially in British Columbia, now here, federally. You've got to find a way to make it salient for ordinary folks. I mean, ordinary, which is like day-to-day people who just otherwise don't care. And so I'll end on this salience point, is that the cure to the ills of democracy is more democracy. It absolutely is. At the exact moment that you think that because of the rise of populist authoritarianism, because of the rise of complex challenges, because of the rise of global instability, that you should be pulling back on democracy, that's the moment you should be doubling down on it. And we've got a chance to do it, and if we can make the case that it's life or death, then I think we have a moment to actually convince folks in power to open up that space. And so increasingly, I think that's going to be on the agenda. The trick is this: can we get it done before we reach the point at which it's too late to get it done? We'll have the growing consciousness because people realize there's a problem. The trick is to get to capitalize in that moment before it's too late, and we're right there. So this is it. This is the year to do it. And if we do it, I truly believe that we can remake the system, and we can ensure that democracy is around for the next 100 years, and the next 100 years, and the next 100 years after that.
I want to just quickly chime in. Political scientists, political strategists show up to politicians' events. They only hear from sycophants and people there to scream at them. They don't often hear, especially in an election, from people with a reasonable question that's going to catch them in a chance to say a real human moment. And for whatever reason, and I partly blame Elizabeth May and Trudeau, there seems to be this zeitgeist in favor of more open events. And I'm actually optimistic when I look at the states and there's 22 Democratic candidates, jumping on tables or putting out hefty policy papers and meeting people all across the country. I do have one last question, and that is, where can people buy the book?
Oh, well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you very much. So, you can buy it from Goose Lane online, if you like books online. Now, someone has gone on Goose Lane and given me 1-star review. I've got one review on my own publisher, and it's a 1-star. The book is actually doing quite well, by the way. It isn't being reviewed very well, but I feel like if someone doesn't like me, they'll also be like, I'm going to go review your book and give you 1 star. I'm like, you know what? It's a pretty sick burn. That is something I totally would do. I respect that. So you can buy it online through Goose Lane or through your favorite bookseller. I would encourage, you can buy it, of course you can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it from Chapters. I would encourage you, if you're able, to buy from your local bookseller. It is available at every local bookseller in the country. They can, if they don't have it on the shelves, they can order it. I would certainly encourage you to do that. And my publisher would certainly thank you. And so would I. And thank you very much. My thanks to you for coming out tonight and for giving me your attention and for sitting through all my swears.